you. Hello, good day to all of you. Welcome to the AFD Tech Talks. Um, Welcome to the AFD Tech Talks on AI and digital transformation competency framework for civil servants. In today's talk, we will have our guest is Prateek Sibal, a program specialist at UNESCO. So he's a program specialist on digital innovation and transformation at UNESCO. And he has a long profile. I'll be talking about that very, very soon. In the meantime, I'd like to welcome all participants to this today's event. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be having several conversations like this. So in this particular session, it will be in line with UNESCO's report that was recently launched on the competency framework for AI and digital transformation for civil servants, which we find it to be an excellent report and also an excellent topic to start looking into, because if civil servants do not really have the right skill sets, we cannot have effective governance or policies to ensure proper transformation, and also to build the sustainable development goals that we are actually interested in, and also to facilitate transitions towards the SDG. So thank you so much for being here. As you connected online, there's a question tab that you can use to ask all your questions. And the good part of it is that you can also vote, right? Questions that you like. So you can like questions so that they can move up. So feel free to ask all your questions. And there's also a chat button that you can also use that to have conversation. So the chat tab is there for you to use. To be great to have a hello, let us know where you are connecting from, right? Or the organizations you are coming from. It's also an opportunity to get to know each other and also know where you're connecting from. So kindly use the chat button and also the question button so that we can move some of these questions up after the conversation. So as part of the run show, there will be presentation by our speaker on the topic. This will be about 30 minutes, 30 35 minutes, and then we will have a series of conversations, more like follow-up questions based on what we have learned, the insights we've learned, and some of the questions that probably were, or some of the insights that were not actually brought up due to the time of the presentation. And then obviously we will have public discussion, so all your questions can be dropped in and then we can follow up on that. At the end of the talk, we will also be sending you a takeaway, right? A takeaway on the tech talk. So this will be sent directly to your emails with a link to the recorded version of this particular talk. So a quick presentation of our speaker today, Prateek Sibal from UNESCO. So he's a technological policy researcher working to understand the impact of digital technologies, especially artificial intelligence, especially on society, focus on openness, human rights, and also multi-stakeholder engagement perspective, right? And the idea is also to work on inclusive access, right, in this particular domain. So he works at the UNESCO's Digital Innovation and Transformation session in Paris, the headquarters as the expert in this particular domain, where he advises governments and also develop programs to reinforce human and institutional capacities for policy making, right? So He has a lot of things on his profile. He also has links with Science Po in Paris, and I mean there are a lot of things that we can say about our speaker today. His field of expertise obviously into e-governance, e-transformation, innovation, AI, policy design and delivery, and also inclusive social development. So he has a vast profile, so we are very honored to have him as a speaker. So as we talked about, feel free to use the chat questions, and then I will say over to our speaker as he presents his talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter and Claire, for inviting me and for organizing this discussion. And thanks to all the participants who've joined from around the world. So, my name is Prateek, as Peter introduced, and I will be walking us through some of UNESCO's work on AI and digital transformation. But first, perhaps I take a few moments to talk about what UNESCO does, and I'll walk us through some of the themes covered by UNESCO. And so, UNESCO is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Uh, it primarily acts through five functions. First is awareness raising, standard setting, policy advice, capacity building, and international cooperation. So what happens is whenever you have new challenges emerging, new policy challenges, or for instance when we saw in the case of artificial intelligence, then there are new ideas coming up in different parts of the world. Well, what are the threats, what are the risks, and how can we use it for our development? And what UNESCO then tries to do is understands what are the good practices emerging out of these different discussions in different parts of the world. Something can be happening in Latin America or Southeast Asia or Southern Africa. And we would be able to bring all the ideas together and look at the good practices. Once we look at the good practices, that allows UNESCO and the member states to develop some kind of global standards and say, okay, this is something, for instance, in the case of artificial intelligence, we looked at, okay, how can we govern artificial intelligence in an ethical manner? So, what are the principles? And these are we as common humanity agree to these principles. So that's the standard setting part. So once you have these global standards, then we work with governments who say, okay, now we have articulated the principles, the areas of action, and so on. But we need to now translate it into concrete policies. So, how do we do that? So, we work with them and our international partners, whether it's from academia, civil society, development organizations, the private sector, to work on policies in a more multi stakeholder manner. So once you have your policies in place, then the natural question that comes to is, well, do we have the capacity to take the policy document to implementation? And so that's the function, that is the capacity building role that we have. uh, and finally, we have international cooperation. This is core of a mandate to facilitate exchange of ideas through word and image around the world, and facilitate collaboration between researchers, between governments, between academics. So all kinds of actors around the world, so that they can learn from each other. So this is the kind of broad context in which we work at UNESCO. And perhaps a little bit about digital transformation. Uh, we're really dealing with questions related to digital divide, related to internet fragmentation, for instance, also related to access to internet content in different languages, multilingualism, and so on. We're dealing with human rights, whether it is freedom of expression, privacy, non-discrimination, and so on. We're dealing with issues related to transparency, accountability, and openness. Openness is a big part of our mandate, whether it's open data, open access to scientific information, open science, or it is about uh, transparency, whether it's in the case of artificial intelligence or other new technologies. Of course, then in the context of digital transformation, we look at what are the regulatory developments? How is this environment changing? What are the good practices? Are the human rights aligned? Are the processes for regulation robust? Do they take into account uh, that human rights are respected, but also people have uh, are respecting rule of law? For instance, you have due diligence processes when you're working on social media content moderation and so on, and you have right to appeal and so we look at regulatory practices, and of course the last part is about capacity building, which is what we will focus on today. But let me outline, kind of Peter mentioned a bit before, the approach that we take to digital transformation, which is what we call the Rome framework, which is rights-based, open, inclusive, access-based, multi-stakeholder driven, and of course we have cross-cutting priorities on gender and Africa. Uh, as you see on the right side of the screen, there's this publication that we did. This typically when we are in the awareness raising and ideas, kind of observing the ideas emerging phase, we look at what's going on, and then we looked at artificial intelligence from the rights perspective, from openness, access, and multi-stakeholder. And this is also available for you to look at in more detail. So moving forward, today's focus is around digital, and it's the long-term goal is to create a world in which digital technologies are an empowering force for people and the planet. This is the whole sustainable development agenda, right? And however, what we need to do is also be demand responsive. And we need to work in a way that responds to the real needs of our member states. So before we started to work in this domain on AI and digital transformation over the past few years, we went to our member states, particularly to our member states in Africa, because we were seeing that a lot of AI policies, digital policies are being developed worldwide, and you you see very clearly what are the policy priorities and needs of different countries in different observatories. But from our member states in Africa, we did not find that information so easily. So we said, okay, let's first go and understand what is the state of the art, what are the policy priorities. And so we launched an artificial intelligence needs assessment survey in 2020, and about 32 governments, countries in Africa responded to this survey, and they requested policy advice and capacity building as two major themes. And there were, of course, certain common areas of which were priority. For instance, personal data protection and privacy, which was identified as urgent, and for instance, data governance as well. Then leveraging AI and digital technologies for economic growth and development. What are the risks to jobs? How can we leverage these technologies to spur innovation, and so on? Then updating skills, knowledge, and education systems was a big concern of the member states. Then facilitating AI related research. We were looking in the study that very little research, when you look at the global publications or researchers who are participating in top conferences, were coming from Africa. And so we were seeing this on the overall side, but we also noticed from the government that they were saying, yes, this is a challenge. So it kind of validates what we were seeing overall. And then of course, so these are some of the broader challenges, the priorities that governments articulated, but then there were some specific ones also. For instance, when we looked at Botswana, and they were talking about how they would like to see AI being used in the mining sector because that is important for their economy. Or when we were looking in Senegal, it was around telemedicine. So different countries, they had certain common priorities, but they had very specific priorities as well. For instance, in Cabo Verde, the idea was about also to think about these technologies with respect to fisheries and so on. So we have to be then also very context specific to go to the different countries and at least put that information out, because we of course can't do everything, but for partners. And actually this kind of report was then used by partners, research institutions, and governments in the continent to say, okay, these are the findings. Let's see how we can focus on developing them further. So to say that this kind of articulated what kind of tools we should develop going forward. And the kind of intervention that we planned was starts in a cyclical manner, where we start with awareness raising, and we looked at, when you're talking about new technologies like AI, the challenge is that we want everyone to come and talk and contribute, but not everyone is equally equipped to talk about these technologies or feels comfortable. So you may want to do a multi-stakeholder process and have young people and people who work in different sectors not related to technology come and contribute their insights. And then you have top-notch scientists or a minister in the same meeting, and people feel like, oh, okay, maybe I don't know enough, so let me not say. And that kind of cuts short the process of developing policies in an inclusive manner. So just to say that we also thought about how can we expand awareness about these technologies through multiple channels. So we, for instance, we recently launched a comic strip on artificial intelligence, and this is fun because then you break down very complex subjects but in a fun manner and accessible manner. And and so so this one is also available in French and Spanish now. If anyone is interested, we'll be happy to share the links. It's free. But then we also develop certain micro learning courses. So if you are joining some of these stakeholder consultations, if you want to quickly kind of spend 2 3 hours and learn about what are the human rights challenges in your daily life, for instance, when you're on social media platforms, what kind of challenges you're facing with respect to artificial intelligence, you can learn through a micro learning course that we launched with UNITAR, which is another UN agency. And this is now going to be available in about 25 languages. Uh, then we have the needs assessment methodology that we did, and we are now replicating it in small islands and developing states. Based on these things, we recognize that capacity building is is a major need and needs to be anchored in an overall framework. So we developed this artificial intelligence and digital transformation competency framework, which is going to be the focus of our discussion today, to to provide a more comprehensive view of what is it that policymakers, civil servants need to know in terms of knowledge, skills, and attitudes to enable digital governance, but also if they are implementing digital transformation projects in government, how do they do it? What are the competencies? So, but that's just really the first part of the picture. Uh, so moving on, I think let's spend some time. Peter, you wanted to come in? No, okay. Do let me know if I'm running out of time, or I will keep an eye on the
No,
time.
no, no.
But
You're on face. I mean, you're doing great. So I'm just enjoying the
okay, okay.
conversation, and
Uh,
it's. I mean, I was just looking at the fact that you have all these things, these resources available in several languages. I think that is also very good thing. So it's not only produced in English and French, but in several language that broadens it. For several stakeholders, and the fact that you also had this, I didn't know about this comic approach. I think it's an excellent way of also promoting AI education on that. So I mean, that's a great thing. I mean, about the awareness rising, I mean, this a big issue that has to be done. We'll come to that during the deeper conversations on that, so I'll let you continue. Yeah.
Thank
And in
you,
the
thank you.
meantime, if participants have questions, feel free to use the chat button on that. And welcome to those who just connected. Thank you, Patrick.
Absolutely, yeah. So now talking about the opportunities of digital transformation, right? There is a huge potential for improving how public services are delivered. I mean, so many countries are moving towards government as a platform kind of an approach, where they create platforms on which further services can be developed and so on. For example, let's talk the case of judiciary in Brazil, and in Sao Paulo, they basically developed a digital solution for the judiciary that accelerated the processing time for cases by 87%. And people now require 2 minutes to register their information as compared to 21 minutes uh, before. But as part of this process, it's not just the development and deployment of the solution, they also trained about 50,000 employees to work on this, because that is an important piece of the puzzle that we sometimes miss. So there's this example, but for instance, there was another example that we looked at in our study in the United States, in Michigan. They were using for public utilities, for people to access this, for customer relation management and so on, a single number and a website that guides people. So it's really a simple interface where you can access all your services. In France, we have several portals where we can access all kinds of different government services in one place. So these are some tools which are helping improve public service delivery. I can say also, for instance, in India, they developed the digital ID project, which is Aadhaar, which is then being used to, once you have an ID, you you are able to open bank accounts, and millions of people's bank accounts were opened. That means they have access to then financial services. When if you were before going to a money lender, now you can go to a bank and get loans at a very low interest rate. You can have access to health services because you have an ID system which is linking you to different parts of the government and is allowing them to know who you are who you claim to be, which is a big problem in a lot of developing countries where we don't have fully developed paperwork, birth certificates and registrations and so on. So a lot of digital solutions are being deployed to address these challenges in public service delivery, also to cut down losses, cut down leakages in food distribution systems and so on. Then there are also complex governance challenges, right? So we are not living in a world where we have linear ways of working in government. If you, for instance, you have challenges related to environmental degradation, global warming, inequalities rising, you have threats of pandemics. So civil servants are not, it's not like a world where we have one intervention for one problem. You have to think of problems in an overall way, and you can actually use some of these digital tools to 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 first understand and then deploy them to address some of these complex governance challenges. And for instance, I was talking about public engagement. You can use these softwares for easier engagement with the public, but mind you, there's also then this challenge of digital literacy which comes in. If you develop these tools, are you excluding then people? So that is something that we need to keep in mind. uh, Another example comes from Panama, where the government was implementing a 6-year project to provide end-to-end experience of the justice system. And they by looking at the design of the whole system and where do people interface with the system, and then they optimize those points with a very user focus approach. And once they redesign their physical infrastructure and the digital infrastructure that allowed people to interact with the justice system, uh, they reduce the time by about 96% that people used to take to engage with the system, and they went paperless. So these are some of the examples of how successfully governments have deployed these kind of systems. Then transparency and accountability is also a major area. For instance, in Brazil, the image that we see on the screen is also this the system that they developed, an AI system called Rosie, which is looking at the public expenses of the Congress members. And these patterns, they are looking at it, and then they try to detect some kind of suspicious spending patterns. And this project is then bringing more transparency, and it is really based on access to information laws. This information is available publicly. You just leverage that information to to make it more accessible, to make it more actionable for people. And so these are some of the opportunities, and of course there are many more opportunities of digital transformation that we can talk about. Just some other examples that we can see, uh, how AI particularly is being used in trash detection on the streets of Amsterdam using computer vision, and you can identify, and the process of cleaning becomes faster, quicker. You are using in for instance, uh, distribution of benefits. They're using AI systems in Sweden, then for old age support in Spain to help elderly population remember their appointments and so on. So there are multiple applications possible for AI which can help improve public services. Now, a lot of these examples on AI, particularly, are coming from developed countries, uh, and that's a challenge. We are now seeing some waves of picking up of the use of AI in a lot of developing countries, and but I think what is important to highlight is that the context really matters. And when we are talking about AI, we should not only say, well, it's great, we should use this technology and it will help us solve all problems. It's definitely not the case, because sometimes you don't have the conditions to be able to use that technology. You don't have access to the data that is needed. You don't have a data governance system in the public sector which is mature enough to handle this as well. So I think it's a step by step approach, and it's also important to underline that not all problems require high tech solutions. You can also work with low tech solutions or non-digital solutions even. So these are some of the things we'll talk about in the competency framework. Now, moving towards the challenges, we looked at kind of three major challenges. Some are cultural and organizational barriers. For instance, there is aversion to experimentation and innovation in the public sector. There is a low level of leadership support to encourage innovation. Then, when it comes to data infrastructure barriers, something that I was talking about briefly now, there is lack of IT system investment, lack of a mature data organization, and the data governance practices, whether it's about the flow of data, the exchange of data, the privacy aspects of it, the security, the cybersecurity aspects of it, may not be in place in all situations. Then there's of course the human resource capacity challenges, where there's low investment into skills for people, whether it's around basic digital skills, around data driven data analysis, and how to do policy making and public services in a more data driven way. Uh, so some of these challenges are kind of found across the world, whether it's in an advanced economy or a low and middle income country. And well, oh, okay, I covered this. uh, so perhaps I can talk briefly about some of the specifics in when we talk about cultural and organizational barriers. We can One of the things that came out in our report was that there is a very siloed strategy and decision making process, that one part of the government would not know what the other part of the government is doing. And I can attest to this, because sometimes we engage with governments and we are talking to one ministry, and the other ministry in the government is also trying to do something similar, but they've never talked to each other. They are trying to replicate almost the same thing on their proprietary platforms, which are not interoperable, and spending public resources. But if they were looking at it from a more top kind of a scaled up view, they could have identified, well, we could work together. So there's a lot of siloed ways of working. There's some bit of risk aversion, which one can understand in bureaucracies. That is a challenge. Uh, of course, we should not forget that budgets are a big challenge. We should not think that digital transformation is happening and there is a lot of money available. This is also competing with resources which could go to education or health or to poverty alleviation. So these are important aspects that we need to think about. In terms of culture, in traditional workplaces, there's like lack of questioning. Uh, I remember when I was working in a government agency, it would be challenging because you would ask, and people were like, why do you ask so many questions? I was like, well, I think I would like to know what's going on, and if we can do something better. It's not to question authority, but to really get us to a better position. And this is a challenge that we found in the research and the interviews and so on, and the literature. And finally, there's the closed and hierarchical styles of working which are commonly found, which are not always conducive to more agile, iterative, and experimental ways of working. So these are some of the barriers that we talk, which are organizational and cultural ones. Then, of course, when we talk about data and infrastructure, we should not forget there is lack of available and accessible data sets, because in a lot of cases data is being produced, but either it's not been collected, stored properly in proper formats. It's painful if you have to go through PDF files and extract data. That's not the way to go about it. So some of these data management and data governance practices need to be more robust. One thing that we often miss is about connectivity. And for instance, in Africa, 300 million people are living about 50 kilometers away from a fiber optic cable or a broadband connection. So we can talk about digital transformation, but we need to be cognizant of the hard realities around infrastructure. And this is something which should be reflected also in policies when they are doing a diagnostic of where the country stands to develop the vision forward. Uh, some of these are data driven and infrastructure challenges. And of course, I've talked about the challenges related to digital skills, related to training and capacities for policymakers in the government, and how they are supported. So next, I think what we will I will show you a chart which is kind of confirming all these things, which is a survey of chief information officers in governments. And an estimated 80% of public sector leaders say that they have fallen behind the private sector in capabilities, and with only about 26% saying that they have the capacity to successfully uh, implement digital transformation strategies. And 51% of chief information officers who were surveyed by this by Gartner say that they are blocked from inspiring digital transformation processes because it's very siloed approaches, or it's just difficult. You keep on hitting the wall even if you want to innovate. So just to give you a flavor of the kind of opportunities that exist and some of the challenges that we found out in the study. Now, I've talked about broadly the study, but it's also important to talk about how it was done. And this was not a process where we had a group of researchers sitting somewhere and writing a report. It was actually a multi stakeholder working group, which was established at the UN Broadband Commission, which is co led by ITU and UNESCO, where we set up a working group on AI capacity building, and UNESCO and Nokia co-chaired this working group. As part of this group, we had members of the private sector, civil society, we had government representatives, we had representatives from different UN agencies, so that we ourselves don't have a siloed approach and we work together if we are developing global solutions. And then we ensured that we had regional consultations. So we engaged digital transformation experts in different parts of the world, whether it was in Latin America and Caribbean, Southeast Asia, in Africa. We learned from them what are the challenges that they are facing in their different regions, and to try to reflect those challenges in this kind of global study. So, and of course there was this working group that developed the framework. Now, coming to the framework itself, so mapping to all the challenges and the opportunities that we've talked about, the regional perspective and so on, uh, we identified basically three domains of competencies: digital planning and design, data use and governance, and digital management and execution. And I'll talk briefly about each of these, as to what each of these covers. And then we will perhaps dive into specific ones depending on how much time we have. But the good part of the webinar format is that we can we can spend some time peacefully looking at things instead of rushing in a 5 minute talk. So when we talk about digital planning and design, it enables civil servants to understand the complexity of today's problem, recognize what are the strategic opportunities that exist that can use digital solutions, and how they can then design projects. So this involves competencies like systems thinking, problem identification and solution, strategic foresight, and how do you develop strategies in an agile manner. Then when we talk about data governance and use, it really talks about the use of data, its fundamental role, the value that you can derive, because we have a lot of data, but are we deriving enough insights from this data? That is a problem. And what are the inherent risks when you're using data? So it's talking about how do you manage data effectively, ethically, and responsibly. And the competencies that we talk about are digital literacy, data driven decision making, open data and open government, a focus on privacy and security. Then, also, as these digital technologies are developing, you need to think about how do they stand with respect to the legal and regulatory frameworks that we have now? And do we need to update those frameworks? And so, policymakers need to think about these challenges. So, not only the launch of a technology or the use and widespread adoption of it, but also how it is influencing society and what kind of regulation is needed. Then, of course, we talk about fundamentals of AI and what kind of AI related knowledge people can have. What we tried to do in this competency framework was also present these competencies by different proficiency levels, because we understand from all the surveys and the studies, the consultations, that not each country is at the same stage in terms of development and needs. So when you're talking about so we have the basic, intermediate, advanced, and AI specific. Not all countries need AI specific, or not all countries need advanced. So the beauty of the framework is that you can also contextualize. You can say, okay, these are the objectives in my ministry or department for digital transformation, for based on our national context. And then we need these competencies, and maybe a director needs certain advanced competencies in management. So you can really pick and choose the competencies based on the roles that people have in the government and the context. Then finally, we have the digital management and execution. So going from planning, then the data aspect, then you also have to think about digital management and execution, because a lot of times people are joking during the consultations that we are talking about digital transformation, but it stops at the digital and people forget about the transformation aspect, and nothing gets transformed at all. You just have a software piece which is installed, and voila, it stops. So digital management and execution really talks about people centricity, how you need to design solutions for the people, keeping the user in mind. One specificity that came across in the discussions was, let's not talk about only user centricity, let's talk about people centricity, because not everyone is yet a user. So how do you cater to people who are not able to access digital services? In your strategy, you need to think about them also, and not just say, okay, this is the typical user, because then you are excluding so many people. Then about iteration, how you need to move move forward, test, experiment with your solution, and then update it, instead of using this waterfall approach, and you just develop a finished product and then realize that, oh, we missed so many aspects or user needs, and they're just not reflected. uh, Agility in execution, and some aspects around digital leadership. So these are the broad domains, the competency domains that we're talking about in the framework itself. Uh, Now, depending on the time that we have, I have prepared for each competency to walk us through as to what we are doing, but I don't know if we have enough time for that. But
we
I
we
don't know,
we
Peter,
we
you are
we
the
we
boss.
we still have ample time, so you can have about 10 minutes throughout that. But in the
Okay.
meantime, should participants have questions, feel free to drop in as we discuss further. Claire has dropped quite a lot of resources online, so she'll be sharing also the full report, the links to the full reports on the chat. So feel free to bring up your questions. So, uh, Pratik, there's one thing that you also talked about. I mean, that I also found very interesting. The fact that people have to question. People are not so good at asking questions, right? And we can see that it is important that the culture of questioning is taken quite seriously. For instance, given the generative AI solutions that we currently have, like ChatGPT, that most people have started playing with, you notice that the way you frame questions, the way you ask questions, lead to several resources, right? Several results, right? So being question centric, or asking the right question, or knowing how to frame the right questions, is also a very good area for us to explore as we innovate together. And yeah, so I'd like you to talk more about some of these things. And thank you so much for highlighting some of the strategy challenges and also the opportunities that exist, because this is very good for an organization like AFD, because this also helps us to actually identify some of the needs right on the ground, right? I've seen we have a demand driven approach, but I like the way you approached in the whole process, right? The open consultation, and also being able to identify some of these needs, and also how the design was being done. So I'll leave you to continue the conversations, and then we'll come back on that. So
Thanks for the remarks, Peter. And for the participants, please feel free to share your questions. And it's really a dialogue because we also want to learn based on what people are thinking, because this process never ends. We have the framework, but then every few years it will need to be updated. So happy to also learn. Okay, so I'll briefly talk about the competencies, not with a lot of detail. So you will have the slides and the framework report and so on, so you can dive deeper into it. So systems thinking is really we are facing complex problems that are not linear, and public administrative systems are really based on this command and control model, where you have which functions well in stable systems. But when you have new challenges emerging every other day, you need to think about how you address complexity in government. And then there are certain tools to use to do that, so you can actually learn how to think about it in a more structured way. So that's what we're talking about when we're saying systems thinking. How do you how do you address interrelated problems? It's not that you address one and then something else goes bad as a consequences of that. How can you think overall, so that you don't miss out on things? Then of course, as I was mentioning, it's structured by proficiency levels to adapt to the different needs. You were mentioning problem identification and solutions. This really goes to the heart of questioning. To understand the problem in depth, being able to know and use the tools for identifying the root cause. So whether it's problem trees, or the why techniques and so on, or through ethnographic research, to identify and understand the problem and then design solutions. So as an example, a mid-level manager, for instance, in the Ministry of Justice, working on an access to justice problem to deploy by deploying digital solutions, would take like a problem driven iterative approach, looked at, like we saw in the example of Panama, look at what are the interfaces, where are people engaging, what are the challenges they are encountering at each step, then think of a system redesign and so on. Then we have strategic foresight. So this is really helpful because you need to anticipate and address rapid change and uncertainty that we are facing. I mean, we all have seen uncertainty in the past 3 4 years. It's been crazy. So how do governments think through these things? How do they anticipate? And it helps future proofing by stress testing existing or proposed strategies. What happens when we take it to the limit, or an event happens where our policies for digital transformation, whether it's a flood situation or it's a natural disaster, and you're running your whole show on digital platforms, how does it work? So you need to think about what happens in the future, some foresight elements, and how technological trends impact societies, and then developing projects based on that. At the same time, because you are constantly looking at the future, the strategy making process should be flexible enough to accommodate changes and revisions. It should, while we have medium and long term plans in all our organizations and governments, but there should be scope for making some changes and revisions, and that should be built in the process, because it's not fixed. The world is quite changing quite rapidly. So these are some of the more planning aspects of the competencies that we are talking about. Then when you move to data use and governance, then it becomes more operational, which is across the board. So digital literacy, I mean, we don't need to talk so much about literacy. It's just digital literacy is needed for everyone today. So if in the AI advanced stage, if you would talk about a civil servant who's working with, say, predictive system that classifies people based on the potential needs, on their potential needs, are aware of the system's pitfalls and when it is prone to making errors, and they are equipped to regularly detect faulty recommendations coming out of the system. So that is the level of literacy, digital literacy, is needed if someone in government is working on artificial intelligence. But otherwise, you need basic digital literacy, which can be around using computers, softwares, and so on. Then data driven decision making, I think this is really core of public administration in today's time. So how you can use data to solve these problems. uh, a data driven public service really recognizes the value of data, its collection, its integration in the policy making processes, and how you generate insight. So this is important to create solutions and kind of solve all kinds of problem with when you have big data available. For instance, what we saw in Brazil, you have access to information on the congressperson's spending, and then someone can use it to inform how basically accountability practices and so on. So that is an important aspect, and the competencies needed for that. Then you have open data and open government, basically making your data sets open by default, making them interoperable, making ensuring that it's not in weird formats but actually are usable, because this also helps build in public trust and people to leverage government data to develop more services. For instance, I think there was an example how in New York they were publishing timing of the subway system when the trains would come and so on, and someone developed an app based on that system. This is just government data which is available for someone to develop services on top which can improve people's lives and make it easier. So there's this competencies around open data and open governance. Privacy and security is of course an important area. The risks to human rights, to information privacy and security. Then the legal and ethical frameworks that we talked about on what kind of new so that your technology is not being developed in vacuum, and the legal officers in a government department need to stay up to date and informed about emerging technologies enough to be able to protect how they might need to be regulated as they become more widespread. So that's an important area. uh, AI fundamentals, we briefly touched upon. If you are using AI, then you need to really understand how it is impacting society, because from search engines to Google Maps, it's everywhere. It's from Netflix recommendations, it's just everywhere. So we need to understand how it is impacting, from chatbots that we are engaging with government services and so on. So then we move to the management and execution part of it, and I'm watchful of the time. So we talked about people centricity a bit. This, for instance, if you are a service designer, you would use a range of research methods, whether it's questionnaires, in-depth interviews, workshop, ethnographic observations, to obtain insights about the users, the people who are interacting with these services, and then design. Because the risk of exclusion is huge if, for instance, you are rolling out uh, a food distribution system by a government, and if it is based on whether your fingerprint uh, can be detected by the government software, and then you get your rations. And if there is a problem in that detection, you work as a farmer or a manual laborer, and your fingerprints don't always match, and so on, you will be denied your food subsidy, and that can have life and death consequences. And these are real examples. I'm not taking names of countries, but these are challenges that we need to think about. So that's why it's important to observe and see and deeply research before these solutions are developed. Iteration, we talked about the importance of managing innovative projects, using prototypes to explore new approaches, and conducting tests and experiments so you can rapidly improve based on user feedback, based on the designer feedback, and whether the service is being delivered well and not. Execution needs to be agile. You need to be able to respond to the public, but also as a public sector need to collaborate, adapt, and be flexible. And finally, the leadership needs to be empowering, because teams in the government, they should create enough room for their members to be able to take initiative, experiment, and within a common vision, of course, to design these user driven services. And finally, when we launched this report, we came up with recommendations, and we always come up with recommendations that are general but also specific. So we need to raise awareness about competencies that are needed, because we need to talk about what are the challenges, barriers, and then what policymakers need to learn about. We need to support governments in adaptation of this kind of a framework to their context, because this is a global framework. Not everything is applicable to every government. We need to support them. Make learning resources. So having a framework is one thing, but then identifying what kind of resources are needed to learn and support that capacity is an important next step. And then also monitor the impact of capacity building, because a lot of times what happens is that capacity building can be conceived as, okay, we do a 3-day training and the job is done, but that's not how these things will change. There are approaches where you embed uh, project based approaches. So perhaps it's better to work with a digital transformation team which is already implementing projects, and then work with them on capacity so they can actually apply. Because to learn about or agile strategy making or agile execution in isolation and not having the opportunity to execute it means nothing. Because, well, good to learn, but so what? So there is a importance of monitoring and impact of capacity building. Then, for of course, there's a lot of capacity in private sectors, so the private sector can share its expertise and knowledge. Academia has an important role to play, whether designing interdisciplinary programs at the university level which integrate all these elements. When, for instance, you're studying public policy, this is important to ensure that people are able to also apply some of these solutions. And for governments, then of course, to have a more holistic approach, and when they're designing digital policies, not just focus on the national policy and what a country needs, but also to focus on what kind of capacities they need to develop. And I think that should be an integral part of any kind of digital transformation strategy or policy which is being developed at a country level. So I think this brings us almost to the end. This last slide, just to share what we are trying to do. We are now developing an assessment methodology, not only for individuals but also for institutions. Basically, a diagnostic tool to say, okay, we can help you contextualize. Uh, we help you assess where you stand, and then identify what are the competencies that you need based on what are your strategic priorities, and plans in a particular country or a ministry or a digital unit, because there's so many names of these things now. So and then we match you with resources, we help you with training, we link you with partners and so on. So that's something that in the process of developing. And thank you so much for your time. It was great to be here. And feel free to reach out to me. I have shared my details. Thanks, Peter and Claire. Over to you.
Uh, thanks so much. Thanks so much for the detailed presentation. I'm actually impressed, and not so surprised. So thank you so much on that. I had quite some few follow-up questions, but I prefer to let the audience take priority, right? So I'll pick one question. I think the first one from Olicia, if I'm not mistaken, says, "Hi everyone, I want to express my gratitude for this event as it has been very enjoyable. Obviously, thanks to you, the speaker. I have a question regarding adapting and updating the competence framework in response to emerging technologies and trends, right? So, how I think that's an excellent question. So, uh, is the competence framework that we have it is static, right, in a way. So how do we adapt it to obviously how emerging technologies are actually moving and the current trends? So and how can this be done effectively? So there's one open question. I don't know whether there's another one. So I would like us to address that. But in addition to that, there was another thing that I also had in mind, which also has to do with the earlier on you talked about the Gartner curve, the Gartner hype cycles, right? So you have a lot of some of these the advances in technologies, right? I'm just trying to make a link with what Alicia actually talked about. So you have this hype cycle, right? So how do we adapt such an excellent framework to evolving trends, right? So that's I think that's a big question. I don't know if you would like to react to that now. Yes, and then I'll pick other questions.
Sure, sure. Thanks for those excellent questions, and thanks to you and to the participants, Peter. Perhaps I go first with the question from Alicia. Uh, so if you notice, the framework itself actually is not a technology centered framework. We don't talk a lot about one particular technology. We have certain AI specific elements because that is what we were particularly looking at, but all the others, yeah, it's not in gradation. So you have basic, intermediate, advanced proficiency levels, and then AI specific, but which doesn't mean that AI specific is more advanced than the advanced level. It's just a separate thing. We spend a lot of time thinking that this should not seem that this AI is after advanced, right? So it's just that we wanted to highlight certain AI specific challenges and competencies. Now, when we are talking about the other domains, you'll see they are not technology centered. They are more oriented towards challenges in the public sector that it will face in implementing technology based projects, digital ID, digital platforms, and whatnot that they do, and in digital governance, so that when the society and others are doing it, they they have a regulatory framework which allows them to do it in a manner that is aligned with human rights, openness, inclusion, and so on. So the framework itself is not technology focused per se. You can, if there's something new emerging, you can still apply it. Having said that, we always, in the process of updating the frameworks, we see, for instance, we have also a competency framework for teachers, and I think over the past 15 or 20 years it has been updated 3 times. So based on the trends and challenges that are emerging, there is a of course these things need to be updated then. So that's to answer the question from Ulysia. Now there is
Excellent.
also
Yeah.
the this aspect about adaptation. That's why we really kept it makes it a bit of a boring document sometimes, because you have a lot of detail and a lot of text. But the point is to make it adaptable to different contexts. And for that, you need, for instance, you were saying, Peter, France. How do you adapt this to France? So, France would then articulate what are its digital transformation related and digital governance related priorities. Okay, we want to achieve XYZ by this year. We want to ensure that our platforms are interoperable across the country, more data is available openly, and we want to train X number of people across the government services to be able to do that. And then they identify, okay, to what level do you need to train? This kind of also answers a bit the question that I think Maria is posing, which is around, if you have people who are working for about 15 years and then you bring in new technology, how do you adapt? You have to see basically the level of a particular competency that is needed for a particular role in a particular department. You don't necessarily need everyone to have for instance, knowledge about what are the legal and ethical frameworks for governance of data. But you probably need at the operational level to know that there are certain processes for sharing of data, for protection of privacy, and so on. So you adapt based on the roles. And that's a process that has to be driven by the governments, because they know what are their priorities. We are not in the business of saying, well, do this or do that. We're like, we have looked at the good practices around the world, and this is what we've come across. Now we can help you contextualize and have consultations within, we can facilitate that process. But ultimate decision making is for governments to decide what they want to do with that, because that also brings the legitimacy and ownership and so on. Yeah.
Thanks so much for the response, which is quite in phase. I think there was another question from Blank Blanksha, right? Which is what should be the steps in order to implement the AI use and competencies in the public service or organizations to ensure the adaptation of civil servants. I mean, part of the question has been answered also in the framework, I assume. Uh, but I mean, how do you call it? The framework, the link to the framework will also be shared for details. But in case you want to react to that question, I'll let you react to that. So that's one. And then I have another question, which is more on we have the competence approach. I mean, that's one side of the story. The other part is how do governments actually rebuild trust, right? How do governments rebuild trust in public administration and keep engaging with the public, right? So we have civil servants. Given that, I mean, their competence level or the proficiency moves pretty high, right, to the advanced stage, right, and they start building initiatives or that kind of stuff, right? So how do we rebuild trust, right, in public administration on that? I don't know if you want to share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question, because one aspect about legitimacy is also about how how effectively governments are engaging with citizens and how responsive are they to their needs. And one way in a lot of countries is through the design of public services and how efficiently they are able to help people. So there are multiple aspects to building trust, right? You need to have very clear and effective communication. and consistent communication around digital transformation projects that you're doing. It should not be the case that you launch a service with a big show one day and then 5 weeks later the service is no longer available, or your platforms are crashing. And this has happened, for instance, in major health system rollouts in very advanced countries, uh, that the this insurance platform just crashed, and people were not able to register. So that has happened. There is an example also, um, from another European country where you had public, basically, people were getting benefits, uh, allowances being given to them through the government, but there was an AI system which was being used to detect fraud, and there was a problem with that system which led to denial of these benefits to a lot of people whose lives were badly affected because they didn't have access to the resources that they were legitimately uh, due. So you have to be, at one end, be aware of the failures that these systems, when you deploy them, can lead to um, drop in trust. And at the same time, if they are efficient and they are good, that helps people understand that this is a reliable way to work, and we have access to a lot of these services. For instance, uh, when I mean, I come from India, and when I use digital services, uh, a lot of it is quite fast now. You don't have to go to a bank with 100,000 papers of birth certificate, passport, this card, that card to open a bank account. You just go and you give them one number, your digital ID, and then that's it. So you are able to access a lot of services based on these kind of digital, what is being called digital public infrastructure, based on top of which more services and so on are being built. So I think the way you design it, and if you forget people centricity and these kind of competencies, then of course it's a recipe for disaster. So you need to be able to build trust. You need to do that. The other thing is also, coming to your question also, Peter, that in some cases there is, for instance, when a particular country is developing its policy, and if it's relying too much on external input, you may have a lot of beautifully well designed, crafted policies and documents which are very innovative and on paper would be very like, wow, this is going to happen. But then you also have to think whether there is the capacity to implement it and sustain it. You can design a very complex system, but if later on, if you have a donor who's working in a country and saying, okay, we will second some resources and finance some people to maintain these services, but that is not forever. That is for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. And then what happens? So are you also developing capacities within the country? And human resources is a big challenge in this domain. Yeah.
Thanks so much. So that really hits a lot on local ownerships of projects that are being financed to ensure that it's also sustainable, right? Do we really have the local skills? Do we really have local ownership of such innovations to ensure that it's sustainable? There's a question. We'll be wrapping up very soon. There's a question from Julie. On the chat, which is, how do you avoid a further gap between policymakers and the realities and problems of civil society to which it's supposed to apply, right? I mean, how do we broaden a gap? I mean, building on a competency is one way. I mean, it's one big way of doing it. And then the other part of the question is more, and between countries of the North and the South, the approach of teachers and others might not be the same. So how do we narrow such gap? I mean,
Yeah.
I think the first
I,
step is yeah,
I think that's a great question. And
exactly.
what happens? I was reading, there was recently an article by by an economist at the London School of Economics. And she was talking about the model of consultancies and how it is to provide the advice and then move out. And which, in the long term, the state capacity is not strengthened to actually develop their own solutions. And it's not, when we are talking about state capacity, we should also talk about the whole ecosystem. And this is to answer the question from Julie. When we are kind of conceiving our interventions, we always work with a local stakeholder community, because it's just to give you an example, we have a project where we help assess the internet environment in a particular country. The first step in that project is really about going to the country and setting up a multi stakeholder group which will guide the assessment process and which will be very closely involved in the assessment process. And what happens is that through this kind of repeated interaction, when you bring the policymaker, you bring the civil society, you bring the private sector, you bring the academia, you bring them all together at the local level, uh, with repeated interaction, there is process of building trust, and there is a process of strengthening capacities gradually. So this does not happen immediately. You may not have, in a lot of countries, civil society organizations that are strong enough to advocate for human rights in digital technologies. uh, but you have to start and then build upon that process. And that is why it's a bit messy, and sometimes the outcomes are a bit less optimal. That if a development institution was writing a policy versus if it has been written at the country level, one may say, oh well, there are certain things which are not as interestingly written or developed. But that doesn't matter. You need to, I think this we need to think that the process of development is iterative. It is not like a one stop shop solution. You solve it once and it doesn't end. So to build these communities together is important, and that's why we take this multi stakeholder approach to strengthen that interaction. Just on the, in terms of the second point about north and south, I think there are very interesting models in terms of south south cooperation. I haven't talked about it, but we have a program on capacity building for the judiciary. And capacity building for the judiciary, basically we are also talking to them about artificial intelligence and the rule of law, and what are the legal and human rights implications of this. How can the judiciary use AI systems to improve administration. And we saw that in Brazil and in India, out of several countries, there were some interesting open source tools. Which are, in Brazil they have a very advanced system called Justice 4.0 for and also they have a huge caseload. The litigation process in that country is quite active. So they had to design these solutions to streamline administration. So you can also facilitate exchange of knowledge between these countries. So recently we organized a training for the judiciary in Qatar, and we brought the experts who were working on these systems in Brazil and in India to share what they had done in those countries to with the justice administrators and judges in Qatar. So there's a lot of south south learning that is possible, and there is also a lot of context specific solutions. For instance, uh, when you're developing digital ID systems, I think in one of the Western European countries, they were they had to actually incentivize people to develop this, to actually take this ID and uh, to apply for it, because people were like, "Oh, I am not going to do this." Whereas there are examples in low and middle income countries where billions of people have digital IDs, and they're using it well. So there's this possibility to also share these open source solutions. There's this whole thing about digital public goods and digital public infrastructure, which perhaps you will cover
Yes.
in one of these talks one day, uh, which is a very interesting topic where the south south north south technology exchange is also happening.
Perfect. It's been a dense, rich, and excellent conversation with you, and also with the participants online. Thanks so much for the questions that were brought to the table to engage in this conversation. I see there's so much on the report. I mean, reading it, I was like, there's so much to learn, and also listening to you, like, wow, I think I missed some other things, right? So I have to check it out again. So have loved the conversation, and I would like to thank you for making time to have a conversation with us. Now, I'd like to thank all participants for also joining and also having a conversation. As we pointed out, this is recorded. We will send our takeaway notes to you automatically via the email addresses that were registered, and then you also have links to certain resources that Pratik had already talked about, but also to replay the video. I also like to send my special thanks to Claire, who has been engaging in the conversation, and also to our colleagues on the technical background, Delphine Constance and Sylvie on helping and ensuring that this has been quite smooth. And I'd like to thank them all. And we'll be having our next AFD Tech Talk. That will be on the 23rd March. So we will be sending certain information on how to register also online. I think Claire dropped some few messages. So we'd like to thank you all and have a great day. Thanks so much. Bye for now. Thank you.
Thank you and bye bye. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Claire.